Alrighty, I went ahead and turned this on, and we're just gonna start off with some real basic questions here. And kinda, we'll start over here with Dustin and Ken and then Holly. We'll talk about some legislation that you got passed this year that for you really marked the session or meant something for you. So go ahead, Dustin.
So thanks, Ken. One of the things that I think is probably one of the best things that we did is we changed the way we do debt collection for the court system. A few years ago, the legislature allowed an out-of-state debt collector to come in and collect debt for the court system. They tack on a 25% surcharge to everything, and we basically turned that back over to the Department of Revenue. That was something that we'd kind of been working on a little bit around the edges for the entire session, and then we found a bill for it, a home for it at the end of the session, so we were able to get that done. I think that's probably one of the best things that we did this session, in my opinion.
All right, and Ken?
Well, we will talk about the budget, but I will tell you that with the pandemic that evolved during the session and led to really major concerns about the budget, the number one thing that we learned was that our budgeting practices the last 4 years really paid dividends this year. We went into this year with a balanced budget. We went into it with our rainy day funds, emergency funds being full, and that stood us in very good stead as this pandemic played out. We were able to maintain status quo funding and increase K-12 education funding by almost $100 million of new money. So I think that's remarkable under the circumstances.
And Holly?
Well, I was going to talk a little bit about the budget. So I guess I'll kind of come up with a different one. And some of the stuff that just worked on was some child care initiatives. We didn't get everything passed we wanted to, but we did at least get, the governor did sign to allow some emergency weather type stuff, allowing more children to attend a child care, because we are having a crisis with that right now. So I think that's a very small but good step in the right direction to help all Iowans. So.
Well, the big elephant in the room is the budget, and we had a two-part session, so we'll kind of talk about the two-part session, and because you had the part of the session that was, hey, things are looking up, things are good, revenues are coming in strong. So tell me the difference that you saw between that and when you guys returned after COVID-19 allowed you to, subsided enough that you came back. So what was some of the major things you saw that was different?
So I think, that last day of session really, we were all very busy. We had to do some quick standings budget, finishing out the Medicaid and things. When we left, we were at a positive 4.2% in our budget, and within weeks we fell to that negative 1.3%. Which was, it just kind of shows everybody what really can happen and how fast it can go. With, casinos closed and roads closed, I know our RIF budget took a huge dramatic hit. But just as Ken said, with responsible budgeting over the last few years, we were able to, have cash on hand. Our emergency funds were full. That's how we were able to do some of those small business grants. That was all money we had. Very few states can say that they actually had cash on hand and didn't take out loans or, what people would think of credit card type stuff. This was responsible budgeting that caused us to have the money to do all of these different programs that help protect Iowans.
Okay.
And for me personally, Ken, I have been very much involved with water quality legislation, and the governor early in the year rolled out her Invest in Iowa program. And because of the role I play as the chairman of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, I've been involved with that, looking forward to that discussion for years. And that was a big push on the part of the governor's staff. After we came back on June 3, not a word was said about it, which is understandable. And so that's something we're going to have to visit another day. But for me personally, the before crisis to after crisis focus of my work changed dramatically. And so we'll pick that work up again next year.
So much like these two, I think what we saw was maybe a suspension of priorities, I suppose would be a good way to say it. For me, the main issue has been broadband and things that we can do. So a lot of stuff we were working on the House either kind of stalled out in the House or stalled out in the Senate because we were all focused on some other issues when we came back. So my hope is when we come back next year, that a lot of those things, they might be 3/4 of the way done, and so hopefully we can pick them right back up and get them finished off next year.
And if I could follow up a little bit, just for the listeners and viewers, the way the session works, in a normal year is one thing. The way it worked this year was something different. We weren't totally sitting on our behinds during that interim period. I know the House and Senate leadership were constantly working to focus on what was really critical. And what that trickled down to those of us that are committee chairmen was get with your counterparts in the House. Let's get a lot of this work done, agreements reached and that sort of thing behind the scenes, so that once we get back to Des Moines, we can be efficient, we can be quick, and we can get our work done. So for us personally, for us as legislators, the sense of working together as a team was probably stronger than ever.
Yeah, and several of us were thrown into some task force that were special projects
Yes.
during that time, and we worked greatly. I know, weren't you were on one? Was it?
To work to talk with people in various areas on issues that they saw come out of the COVID-19 that they thought we needed to address, and so that's you saw some of that in legislative issues or legislative priorities that came out at the end there.
And I was on a return to learn group. There was 5 of us that contacted parents, teachers, administrators. I contacted individuals from other states to see what their schools were doing. So we were all kind of assigned different tasks to continue to work on, and as the fluid situation kept moving.
Okay. Well, one of the ones that happened because of COVID is we lost several newspapers, and it's pretty remarkable here in our area. We lost several. How does the legislature plan to go forward with, we'll just call it the legals? So people that, the minutes from meetings, or the cities or counties or school systems are wanting to advertise something. Do we have any plans about how to make sure that readers or those people in the community will have access to those files, that information?
So Ken, quickly out of this legislative session came a bill, and it was more directed at the situation in Pella, where the Des Moines Register ended up being their only available paper of record, and so a bill that quickly addressed that. But I think, to your point, that we do need to look at how we do that publication site. I know you and I've had those discussions, whether it's a statewide clearinghouse through the Secretary of State's website, or we simply say cities and counties, you have to put that notice on your own websites. I don't know where that is, but I think it is something that we're going to have to address here sooner rather than later.
I know it probably gives every legislator a little heartburn, because you don't want to pick a fight with somebody that uses ink by the barrel. So I know you guys will be wading into that, very carefully.
Well, and I actually worked on that a number of years ago as a former county supervisor, knowing what we spend on legals and that sort of thing. I did co-sponsor a bill to, I would say, modernize that, update that. It was not popular with some of the local newspapers or some of the newspapers around the state. But with the world has changed in many ways, and technology is one of those, and online provisions for that made sense for me several years ago, and they still make sense. So I'm sure that issue is we're not finished with that.
And the session ended quietly in the middle of the night, and some of your opponents have said that you guys pushed through items at the end so that nobody could have debate. So what would you say to those detractors that say that you tried to pass items in the middle of the night?
Well, maybe I'll start with that, because I've been up there 8 years. I have worked all night at least once in 7 of those 8 years. I believe 2019 was the only exception to that. The point I'm making with that is it's the nature of the legislature that when we're trying to wrap up, there's still a million things out there that Holly wants, or Dustin wants, or someone else wants. And those, we just can't do them all. We would never leave town if we did that. So what happens in the last hours, last couple days of the session, is there's a lot of meetings between leadership and at the committee level to try to find common ground. And as Dustin mentioned earlier on the bill he worked on, you sometimes have to find a vehicle. In other words, you have to attach an amendment on another bill that's still alive to accomplish the goal you want to accomplish. So to the detractors, I would say this was very typical of sessions in the sense that things show up at the last minute, amendments are offered to bills, and to me, it's always a little bit strange to hear that we're trying to do something in the dark of night when absolutely everything we do is live on camera, recorded for future viewing. And in my case, I had a call at 2 a.m. from a constituent who bent my ear for about 20 minutes. I did have time to visit. And so I just, it's a convenient thing to say. It's easy to say. It's easy to point fingers and say you're doing stuff in the middle of the night. It's the nature of what we do.
And I was gonna say, you know, Dustin last year ran a bill, I mean, it was like a 5-hour debate, it ended at 3 o'clock in the morning when we finally passed it. So we did that last year. I think with this year, it's a little different also. There's a couple of bills that I worked on, before we suspended session, and during the interim, I was told that they weren't gonna be a priority, we were gonna, you know, just pick them up for next year. Well, we get up there and it's like, and change of plan, we thought of, you know, some people thought of some different stuff to go with it, and they were back live with, you know, and we were back working on them. And so, you know, this is not I've only been there 2 years now, but the middle of the night thing is not abnormal. Things get picked up quickly and dropped, and it's very normal for us.
So the final thing I would say on that, Ken, is if you actually look at what happens, many of the things that happen, what appear to be quite quickly at the end of the session, are issues, are topics, are ideas and concepts that have been debated maybe for the entire session, maybe for several years. And so they're not new, they're not surprising, they shouldn't be surprising to anyone. And I would say that, you know, both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, file amendments to bills at the last minute. And I would say, at least from our standpoint, those in the minority party appear to file more, many of which have nothing to do with the underlying bill. So it's not a partisan issue. It's that's the way legislation gets passed, in that you have a goal to accomplish and you try to get that goal accomplished. And sometimes, as Ken said, you have to find a vehicle for some of your ideas. So these are not new ideas. They're not new concepts. They're things that have been discussed for quite some time. And in this session, many things did get left by the wayside due to the COVID and all that. And so this, in some cases, was a more efficient way to get things done.
And one final thought on that, just from a logistics standpoint, legislation has to pass the House, pass the Senate, and go to the governor. In this particular year, and help me out, guys, if I get this wrong, but I believe the House adjourned at about 10 p.m. on Saturday night, and the Senate kept going. We went all night till 6:10 a.m. Sunday morning. The House, while we were dealing with stuff the House had sent over to us, then the House reconvened at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning and dealt with matters they had to take up that came over from the Senate. And then we all came back at 1 p.m. on Sunday and wrapped things up. So it's a logistic thing too. It's a matter of House and Senate. The House has to pass something before the Senate can deal with it, or vice versa.
Well, I'm sure somebody's inbox has still got bills that didn't make it from one house to the next.
Yes.
Yes. Well, one of the topics of the day, of course, is the protests, the turmoil our country's going through at the present time. And to that point, there were a lot of meetings in that short session between House and Senate leadership with various groups that wanted to see action. And we did pass a bill, I think it was unanimous in both the House and the Senate, that dealt with the matter of how our law enforcement officials behave. One of them was to outlaw chokeholds. It dealt with that. Another one is to eliminate the the problem of people that are perhaps a law enforcement person that gets let go in a certain location, and then he goes to another town and he gets hired on. And so there's going to be more tracking of that. So the bad actors do not get rehired somewhere else. And there's a third component of that, and I don't remember it. Maybe my colleagues do, but
Well, there was a training aspect, Ken.
training aspect, that's right.
About changing the training procedures at the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy and increasing some of the training regarding officers and addressing minority communities.
Okay. That, and one of those parts of the protesting or conversation that's still taking place is statues. So I know that there's been some recent conversation about statues that are on the state grounds. I mean, we've not really talked about this very far, but any thoughts about addressing what is displayed on the state grounds as far as statues or memorials or things like that? You guys talked about that yet?
We've had no discussion about it. I have my personal views that we don't destroy history so flippantly as is being done in some cases. I value our history, and I think everyone should respect our history, and that isn't saying our history is lily white. It is not. We have a lot of warts. We've learned from a lot of those, and we've made a lot of progress. So it's bothersome to me that in some cases, people don't even understand the history of a particular statute. In fact, people that have been very, very positive, very instrumental in dealing with the problem of racism or slavery are being targeted as well. That makes no sense. So that's troubling, and I just hope people study their history. Let's look at the big picture.
And I'll kind of add to that. If people have not went and actually walked around the Capitol, I encourage you to do so sometime. These guys both know I'm a walker, so when we're getting ready for debate or I'm contemplating and thinking, I walk a lot, and I've actually went and looked at several of these. We have some beautiful, monuments around there that I didn't even know existed until, because usually we're there in January, so I walk the stairs then, but this year when with being at June, I was out and about and looked, and there's amazing things. I mean, there's a beautiful Holocaust museum. Was that a great part of history? No, there are some horrible, sad parts of that. But we also learned from it, just like they said, and I think it's important. And there's one of those there. I know the statue that or the monument they were talking about over the weekend. I've walked by it numerous times. We need to look at these and see the importance of them at the time. The one was it 1938? The one they were trying to take down was put up.
I'm not sure.
It was something like that. And so, while there's tons of discussions, I just do encourage people to go and actually check out how beautiful some of the areas are around there.
Well, and I think, Ken, it's not just beyond statues. I heard that very large mural at the top of the first set of stairs is being requested to be removed. And we have some great works of art in that Capitol building, paintings and portraits, and they're nicer in the Senate chamber. Just look up. But, as Ken said, that's our history. It's not perfect. We're not perfect. We strive to be better, and I think that's what we can hope for. But the artwork there expressed the ideals at the time, where we were going, where we came from, and I think it's short-sighted to simply react and ask that they be taken down. They're works of art. There's works of art that I don't understand or maybe even don't particularly like, but that's what we do when we celebrate our history, our past, and so I would be very cautious when we look at some of those things.
And the response to COVID is always, everybody's mind right now, and cases seem to be spiking. Are you guys considering, or has it floated around that Iowa may be forced to shut down again, and how would the response to that be? Because, if you watch the mainstream media or folks that aren't me, you'll see the alert every day that says it's getting bad, and I don't know if you guys have talked about that or.
We have not talked about it, but let me first of all give plaudits to our governor. I think she handled this in a very honorable and professional and responsible way in the last 4 months. And she is the executive branch of government. As this goes forward, she maybe will have to make some very difficult decisions again, but we have all learned, collectively, we've learned to work together on this. We do have a legislative council that involves, I believe, 24 legislators from both parties and both chambers. And they will be part of any future discussions, it seems to me. And we always have the provision of a special session if that becomes necessary.
I was gonna say, there's the health concerns, of course, but, and then also there's the business concerns. We'll just say, small businesses such as myself were and are teetering on the verge of solvency. So are those considerations that would go into something like that? I mean, it's hard to balance the health and the economic well-being of small business and the state, quite frankly. So, go ahead.
I think our governor's done an excellent job in doing that. Throughout much of the country, you have seen and you still are seeing kind of a knee-jerk reaction that we have to just close down everything, quarantine everybody in their homes, and that's going to make everything all well and good. And that's simply not the case, and I think our governor has understood that. At the very beginning, she was adamant that the reason she was doing what she was doing was to ensure that our healthcare system was not overwhelmed with cases, with severe cases that overwhelmed our ICUs, that outnumbered our ventilators that we had in the state of Iowa. And I think that's how she's been governing with that in her background is that until we find a cure to this disease or a vaccine to this disease, we're not going to stop it. It is simply to slow the spread of it, and that's what we've been doing. And I think the numbers in Iowa are very telling on that. Our healthcare system has not been overwhelmed. Unfortunately, people have gotten sick. Unfortunately, some people have died from this disease, and that's a tragedy. But the policies that the governor's put in place is meant to slow the disease. If you look at the other states that have closed down their state, they haven't stopped it. People are still getting sick. People are still dying from the disease. But then they are also hurting more economically than we are. And so I trust our governor to continue to do what she's been doing, and that is balance those two things and make very tough decisions.
Were you guys part of the consulting of this? Did the governor reach out to the legislature, or just that particular group of legislators and ask questions about, hey, how should we handle this? What part of this response were you guys part of?
I mean, we had a few conference calls, but again, none of us are pandemic specialists. And so, it was a very fluid situation, and we all tried to stay on top of it the best we could. Like I said a little bit ago, we kind of had some task force that we could bring a few of those. But, when it's in that state of emergency, she and her team, I mean, there was, they were all working extremely hard and had more information.
And to your question, Ken, I remember, I don't know what role these other, my colleagues played, but I didn't try to overwhelm the governor with advice or anything like that. I think that's inappropriate. There were occasions on which I would talk to her legislative liaison and pass some information along that I wanted their eyes to be on. In one case, I remember I got a very eloquent letter from a pastor in Pella, had to do with worship and so forth. And I forwarded that letter to the governor's office. And to her credit, the next day her chief of staff called me back personally at the governor's direction, says, call Ken, let him know that everyone in our staff reviewed that letter yesterday. And we know the content of the letter, and we will consider it going forward. So that kind of interaction was part of the process at that time.
I was gonna say, if I remember right, across the state, the calls were for safety, and there was calls also that maybe the government was overstepping its reach through that. So you guys had to wade through that. What kinds of responses or what kinds of directions did you guys give in trying to help keep that balance a little bit, even to your constituents, between safety and civil liberty?
Most of my the input I got from constituents dealt more with civil liberty than it did with safety. That just the way it was. I would say for every email I got concerning safety and the hand wringing sort of things, I got 10 emails saying, we're adults, we can think for ourselves, we're following the news too, we can be responsible. And civil liberties was a huge concern on the part of many constituents.
So, to follow up on that, I think what I did, and I think Ken and Holly did the same, is when we got those concerns from businesses that were struggling, from people that were not happy, I certainly tried to explain to them how the system works. Being one of 150 legislators, I don't have a magic wand. I cannot make something happen just like that. But what I did, and what I know these two did, is we passed those on to the governor, who was making the decisions at that point, and then continue to follow up on that communication between the two, our constituent and the governor's office, so that she had that information from on the street, to make the decisions that she made. And I think, to Ken's point, whether it's on the religious aspect, whether it's on the business aspect, we saw the concerns that our constituents had being addressed with further orders and continuing to open up the state, if you will.
So would you say that that letter from, say, the pastor had an impact on how the state started to reopen then, or review of civil liberties that were taking place during that time?
It certainly played a role in the information the governor was receiving, and I guess it highlighted to me the difficult decisions she had to make, because most of the concerns that were expressed to me were legitimate, whether they had to do with civil liberties or they had to do with safety. It's not that those were illegitimate claims. They were concerns that Iowans had. And that's how tough her job was at that point, was to make some calls. And into that particular case, she conveyed to me that the single hardest thing for her was shutting down the houses of worship and houses of prayer. And that's why she directed her chief of staff to call me and convey that to me.
But Ken, I think that's how Iowa government works, is respectful dialogue from constituents. That's how things happen. That's how we get ideas. That's how ideas move, is respectful dialogue, personalized dialogue from constituents. And so, that's an example of it taking place in this situation, but I think that takes place all the time in our government. That's one of the things why it's humbling, I would say, to serve in this role, is that you see that our citizens really do have a control on what happens in the state of Iowa through that very means.
Yeah, and I think a lot of some of the stuff we did too was just clarify for some of the businesses. Sometimes these proclamations would come out and you would, in her press conference, it would just state something very, just the basics of it, but in the proclamations were the details. And so a lot of times people would jump to conclusions of something, and then they'd, call us or whatever, and then we could work through it with them, and they're like, oh, it's not exactly, I'm like, we can't go through 37 pages of dialogue of exactly every single detail of every comment. We do need to, look at that. So I think we did a lot of that as well. I felt like, I reached out to the staff several times for clarification. They were amazing to work with. Even with everything they had to do, they got back to us very quickly. I was amazed some days at how fast it would get back to us. I appreciated, my constituents that would maybe write with an email to me with an issue, but I loved some of their solutions and their ideas. And I would, we'd forward those on as well, and not just a complaint about this. It was, what about this or this? So I think that's going back to what Dustin said about the open dialogue. It's great when we have those type of conversations.
We'll just wrap it up with any last thoughts that you guys may have about the session, Iowa in general, where we're at right now, or anything else that may be of importance to you. We'll start on Holly this time. We'll go back to her.
I just want to thank everyone. It's been an honor. While this year has been very different with the suspension, it's still been amazing to be able to work for Iowans and represent and do the best we can. I want to reiterate our state budget again, how important it was the last few years. that we have ran a conservative budget because we had the money to help when we needed it. Those rainy day funds, the emergency funds. I'm very proud that we were able to hold together the almost $100 million of additional dollars for education. And so we've worked really hard at holding that. And so while this session was a little bit different than we all expected, there were some great things that came from it.
And I'll repeat the thought that it's an honor to serve Iowans. It's an honor to serve our constituents in the legislature. And as Dustin mentioned, it's humbling because you realize we all have opinions about everything, right? But suddenly our opinions do perhaps change the lives of Iowans, and that's a pretty heavy responsibility. So it is an honor to do that, and I thank the residents of Senate District 40 to give me the opportunity to do that the last 8 years, and I hope for 4 more years. And then one other comment I'd like to say, these two people flanking me are much younger than me, and they each have 2 years of experience in the Iowa House, but they're remarkable leaders, and it's an honor to serve with them. I loved working with Larry Sheets and Guy Vanderlinden, but to have the next generation come on has been a real pleasure and joy for me.
So you're going to hear the same thing that you just heard from these two folks, and that is that public service it's a great thing to be into. It's a great job to have. The fact that your fellow citizens selected you as their voice in government, and then hopefully again this next fall continue to select me and as well as these two as their voice in government, and being able to make those changes. When we get at the end of the year, we get the new code book and we get the new laws, and it's a feeling I cannot describe to be able to look at it and say, you know what, I was part of that right there. This law right here that we changed for the better of Iowa, that's a great thing. And so, it's also great. We've got great colleagues in the House and the Senate. These two sitting here at the table certainly, but other colleagues across both aisles. I think people are surprised when they learn how well our state of Iowa government works and how well we work together. Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. We accomplish a lot for the citizens of Iowa, and I think rightfully so. They expect us to continue accomplishing a lot for them. And so, I certainly would appreciate the support come in November, and I know these two as well, and I look forward to going back to the Capitol in January and serving with them.
All right. Any last thoughts? All right.
We're good.
Thanks, sir.
Thanks for what you do.